Okay, good morning and hello everybody. Today we're going to be talking about, at least for the next 4 installments, we'll be talking about why passenger trains died in this country and how this was a mix of corruption and choice and, other issues we were dealing with. So unlike the other videos, this will probably be less edited and the pictures will be less relevant. We'll just be there more as placeholders. So if you don't really want to, look at them, this can be put on in the background. Just make sure your volume is up enough to hear me. So now that we got that disclaimer out of the way, let's just get into it. So as mentioned in several videos, passenger trains were a thing in America, and they used to be amazing, and now if you're lucky, you get a once-a-day Amtrak train. So we're going to be leaning more into politics on this episode than most of the other installments have, and probably will. Let's just say probably, which isn't to say that transportation and politics have nothing to do with each other. Quite the contrary, politics and transportation are very much linked, and the demise of passenger trains was a mix of incompetence on the part of the railways and corruption on the parts of governments. Prior to the interstate highways and the creation of airports, transportation was largely privately owned, and the only subsidy was contracts to carry mail for the post office. I mean, there were road construction funds as well. So there not being as many highways being constructed prior to the 1950s doesn't mean there were none. It just means that there were fewer and there was less coordination. The Interstate Highways Act was just a whole new beast. So as I mentioned, prior to World War II, the primary long-distance travel method was the train. Part of this was because cars were relatively more expensive and the road infrastructure was much less developed than it is now. For example, most highways in California were at most 2 lanes in each direction, and these highways generally became the main street in whatever town it passed through, meaning that traveling on highways could take a long time to get anywhere, and that's assuming the roads are in good shape. There was once a saying in the northernmost parts of California that was, "Our roads are not passable, they are hardly jackassable." So prior to the 1960s, traveling long distance on the highways was not easy, and the train was usually the only efficient way to travel long distances. Also, prior to the 1960s, air travel was also expensive and unreliable. Propeller-driven aircraft were prone to mechanical failure. Landing in fog was always a gamble, and engine parts I've actually found this out through researching for this, is that they would actually sometimes fall off. And for example, a cross-country flight from Los Angeles to New York in 1941 would cost the equivalent of $4,000. And I'm not sure if that was one way or round trip. If it was one way, that's ridiculous, even by modern standards, even for first class. And also, for example, not the cheapest, but at least a lower berth ticket would cost you $1,200 one way across country on a railroad in a Pullman berth. So, mind you, inflation-adjusted prices. This isn't actually like the what it would cost then. So the cost of flying alone was prohibitive. And another thing that early planes lacked was pressurization. So this means that if you've ever been on a plane or know anything about planes, is that the cabin is pressurized because of the altitude that the planes fly at. Prior to jet airlines, a lot of aircraft weren't pressurized, so you were flying through storms instead of over them like you would now. And if you think turbulence when you go over a storm now is bad, imagine flying through it. So you'd be paying $4,000 for your trip, or at least the equivalent of it, about 3 times that of the train, and it would still take all day. And if you hit a storm, you would be getting seasick because you're going to be bouncing through the storm. Also, you may or may not crash because safety records prior to jets was a lot worse. And another issue prior to the 1960s was that the infrastructure for air travel just wasn't what it is today. So just like with buses and trucking, it took massive federal and state and local investments to make air travel into a viable form of transportation. The difference between air travel today and passenger trains before Amtrak was that the railways still owned their own infrastructure, and the airlines don't own the air traffic control system or the airports, at least in the United States. The main breakthrough that did make air travel viable was the creation of the Boeing 707 in the late 1950s and just jet airliners in general. This enabled reliable and fast transportation almost anywhere within the United States within 8 hours. So this basically did end long-distance train travel, or at least trips that would take multiple days, such as trips from one coast to the other. Even with the heavy-handed regulation of the times, jets flying across the country were competitive on a cost basis with a train. So by the 1960s, the difference in cost of a 3-day train trip and 6-hour flight was more or less comparable, nominally speaking. And this is just my speculation, but I doubt the airlines or other private investors would have paid to build as many airports as the government did or fund the air traffic control system. So the air traffic control system would have probably always been a public service, but we would have far fewer airports had they been privately built versus publicly built. We would have still gotten a few private subsidies like railways did to build in certain areas over others, but overall, if there was less public investment, there'd be fewer airports today. So I do the jump in technology of the 707 was just so much over a train and flying or versus flying. It just made it so much of a leap that there was not really much you could have done to prevent like cross-country trips from becoming dominated by planes. Even if you did it today with high-speed trains going like 200 miles an hour, you're still looking at 15 hours across the country. Like that, even that is prohibitive compared to 6 hours on a plane. Even if you have to deal with the airport for 3 hours, 15 across country, again, still cost prohibitive, or time prohibitive rather. Also, another thing is people do forget that railways, despite being privately owned, did get subsidies to build. These subsidies were large amounts of federal land to sell, and as I mentioned in the Santa Fe episode, the Santa Fe got over 2.9 million acres in Kansas in exchange for building itself from Atchison to Topeka to Granada, Colorado. And this land allowed the Santa Fe to become a continent-spanning system. And this was on top of small amounts of state and local bonds as well. And only one transcontinental railway was ever privately built. So this just shows that the private sector likes working with proven things rather than putting huge amounts of money into big gambles. Cough, cough, the loop, cough, cough. Going on at the same time as the development of jet aircraft, there was massive federal investments in public transportation infrastructure other than rail. This meant that new jet aircraft would be landing in public airports and have their traffic controlled as a public service, which meant two of the biggest costs of running flights that the airlines have to deal with were now all of a sudden the public's problem to deal with only nominal fees being paid by riders, not necessarily by the airlines to cover the costs. I know that airlines do pay landing fees to airports, but again, it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, they pay it, but also it's like nowhere near the full cost of actually running or maintaining the airport, and still public funds still have to make up the difference. So to act like, oh, well, it's still privately owned, unlike Amtrak, they still get massive subsidies that Amtrak just doesn't get, comparatively speaking. And another thing to say is that state and local governments can and are just as corrupt as the federal government, so never forget that if you're a lefty who thinks, oh, local control. Road transportation is, similar but different story. Federal and local and state taxes were used to build highways that were bigger than what the U.S. and state highways were before this. And over the initial building of the interstates from 1956 to 1992, the federal government spent over $500 billion on them, and a good chunk of this was spent when private passenger trains was still in operation. So the federal government spent money creating a competitor to trains to this day and funds them at a deficit. It needs to be mentioned that the gas taxes, again, have never paid for the full cost of maintaining our highways since the beginning of the interstate highway system. So in a sense, some of the tax money that railways pay in general taxes went to the interstate highway system, and the federal government continued to regulate railroads as a monopoly even after it had cars, trucks, buses, and airlines as effective competition. If you want to learn more about traffic and politics, listen to Well, There's Your Problem podcast on traffic engineering, and long story incredibly short is that private interests in the automobile industry got highways built at the expense of other forms of transportation, which has led to us living with massive traffic problems, a dysfunctional public transportation system, air pollution, a weaker economy, and health problems like obesity. And all this had to do with political conductions, not some notion that cars were a market-based solution to our problems. Actually, mostly Robert Moses was to blame with this, which get into a little bit of a history on him, is that he was the consultant of many highway projects in this country and actually helped to design a lot of the ones, I think, into Long Island and just through into New York in general. And he basically used them as quote-unquote urban renewal projects, which basically means that undesirable quote-unquote neighborhoods were going to get demolished to make room for new highways. And to be classified as undesirable, generally you had to be a red line neighborhood filled with, black people, immigrants, and oddly enough Jewish neighborhoods, because he was self-hating Jew, or at least raised Jewish, but still not exactly, still a little bit anti-Semitic, I guess. Now, these neighborhoods were generally not the greatest neighborhoods and could be classified as slums and were kept that way by choice. I know it's trendy to try to view some of the past before, some of the depression through to 1960s era as great and some sort of rose-colored glasses, but these neighborhoods were largely owned by slumlords. They didn't maintain their buildings, and an entire family can be crammed into one or two rooms, and not one or two bedroom apartments. I'm talking literal rooms. And these neighborhoods were generally cheaper to buy and demolish because they were neglected by, one, the slumlords that owned them, and two, by the banks that just wouldn't loan money to the people living there if they did happen to own their own home. So these areas were condemned and cleared to build highways. Some of it was replaced with public housing over time, and building the highways did aid in white flight, which hurt the intercity streetcar lines, which hurt intercity rail as well, and beyond the neighborhoods that were, vacated and destroyed. And also that hurt the local tax base, since, you're taking, massive amounts of land out of effectively private circulation, which means less property taxes, which means your schools will have an eroding property tax base, and as people leave, land values decline. Basically, everything that kind of happens with urban decline kind of gets reinforced as people leave and go move out into suburbs, especially if they're the more upwardly mobile sort of people. So what generally happened after a neighborhood was cleared was that the minorities and immigrant families tended to move into formerly white neighborhood, which again just pushed more white flight, which just further eroded the tax base. And that also generally pushed more highways to be built, which pushed down transit ridership, which created traffic, and, which means, again, weaker economy, less density, more obesity and whatnot. And if you think some of the post-war metro projects are somehow clean of this, they weren't. BART here in the Bay Area led to the MacArthur neighborhood being partially cleared to make room for trains. And then because the state was cheap, they decided to clear more land and put a highway there. And, because again, slum clearance was already done, so might as well make, a bigger swath to put a highway. And, and as you can see, if you put a highway next to a metro line, your metro line is going to be facing competition from a highway, which kind of defeats the purpose of putting a train line into the suburbs to keep people from driving and keeping us from needing the highways, so. Again, you're talking building highways to compete with trains that already existed, and then they would turn around and sometimes build highways to compete with soon-to-be open train systems. It was madness on the part of people who wanted this. So as highway systems got more robust, intercity bus service was also able to expand more rapidly to compete with trains. Intercity bus services also had some similar advantages to airlines. The main advantage was not having to pay the full cost to maintain the infrastructure that they were using. Or to put it more bluntly, again, gas taxes don't pay for the maintenance of the highways, which means that bus services could operate at a discount compared to trains, since railways had to pay the full cost of maintaining their infrastructure from their ticket revenue as well as keeping the train itself running, which towards the end became a bigger gap toward, as the 60s wore on. So other than direct operating costs, and some overhead bus companies only had to pay for a few terminals, which they actually started selling some of them off as service got cut into more remote areas. I also should mention that intercity bus services like Greyhound did exist prior to the Second World War. They were just less extensive than they were in the 1960s. Some railways were concerned with this, like the Santa Fe, which owned Santa Fe Trailways, which was a bus operating subsidiary to compete with Greyhound and complement their train services. So they did exist, but they just were not as extensive and not as robust compared to trains. Also, at this time, since people were relatively less well off and people didn't move as much, people didn't travel as much, so that also helped keep the railways in a good position, because the people that could afford to travel generally only had the option of taking a train. And, just people just didn't travel as much back then as you would now. Like going even a few hours away to visit family was kind of unheard of even then. So, you just didn't go anywhere. So highway construction not only provided a competitor to trains directly by giving people an easy route to drive on, but it also changed the nature of how our cities and the economy worked, and frankly destroyed the economic niche that trains held, whether it be for intercity trips, regional or local or commuter trips. This was done by enabling a lifestyle that required people to drive to live, which just induces more trips by car, and hollowed out inner parts of cities and towns where people would actually be more likely to ride trains and other forms of transit. And a compounding factor on top of this was bus companies rising to start providing cheaper fares at the public expense. And some of this, again, was due to regulations and trains still being treated like a monopoly until 1978. And that was a thing, though. Regulations weren't changed, well after the railways were dying. So that is also a video in its own right, and I will only be briefly touching on this here. And also at the same time, public transit systems in intercity were being bought up and dismantled by the GM-backed company National City Lines. They did this to increase the number of buses General Motors would sell at worst, and at best for them, this would actually force people to buy more buses, since buses are always less attractive than streetcars or trains, so people just end up driving. So the entire transit ecosystem was being destroyed at all fronts. GM and its business allies bought up and destroyed urban mass transit and pushed for more highway construction, and also revisions in the GI Bill enabled suburbanization, which all happened to destroy passenger rail in this country, as well as streetcars and those kind of systems. And the GM streetcar conspiracy has actually recorded history. They did get fined $5,000 for intentionally destroying an industry for monopolistic practices like monopolizing bus manufacturing and the supply chains of such. So they say that, this is just some conspiracy theory that's never been substantiated, then there is actually a judgment against them for it. And the last major blow to the private railways was the loss of the mail contract starting in 1967. I'll end up going over this in more detail in one of the mail train-related videos later on. But prior to 1967, passenger trains carried mail for the postal service, and the railways even ran full mail trains just to handle the volume of mail. And at one point, the railways actually had 10,000 trains carrying mail every day running, and by the 1960s, that would dropped to 190, partially due to like service cuts and the expanding highway system. So as trains started to get cut, the post office had to replace them. So they replaced that with trucks usually and vans. The problem was in the 1950s was that the volume of mail needed to be sorted and transported was so immense that the only efficient way to do it was on a train for at least bigger, more well-traveled routes. So the post office wanted to get rid of the mail contracts too because they did pay a premium to the railway to haul the mail. And according to a volunteer at the Sacramento Railroad Museum who I got to talk to before all this coronavirus started, said he started a career as postal service on a mail train and that the post office paid the railways 55 cents per mile per car to haul mail. And mail trains, like solid mail trains, were fairly long, and the SP did run a mail train from LA to El Paso, and it regularly carried 19 cars, which means the post office would have paid about $10.45 per mile for the SP to operate this train, on top of the wages of the postal employees sorting the mail on the train. And mind you, this is 1045 in like 1950s money, not like modern money. So this was a cost center that the postal service wanted to get rid of, and the elimination of mail trains started in 1963 with the Zone Improvement Plan, which is where we get zip codes from, by the way. I won't go too far into this since a forthcoming video will be about mail trains, but the advancement of technology led to the Zone Improvement Plan, which more or less ended mail trains, and carrying mail was one of the last reasons keeping most secondary trains running in the 1960s, which again led to big cuts. And the loss of the mail train did again basically just killed off all the secondary trains in this country, or not all of them, but at least most of them. So to conclude, following the Second World War, state and local and federal governments used funding to build new forms of public transportation at a deficit and subsidize a new lifestyle for America's middle class. This new lifestyle and new forms of transportation fed off each other and led to the unbalancing of our transportation ecosystem, which then led to poor outcomes for the public, like weaker local economies, increasing rates of obesity, air pollution, other associated health problems, traffic, and which all of which is just a drag on the economy as a whole. The thing that people don't really talk about, and the subject is how building of highways and suburbanization and the development of commercial airliners affected passenger trains. They just kind of, oh, this happened, and this is just kind of a self-evident thing as to why this happened. Final side note is at this time, cities were also implementing parking minimums, which basically took land also from productive use and basically devoted it to car storage. This is an effective suburbanization that I forgot to mention, and I just didn't know where else to chuck it, so I'm just throwing it in here at the end. So to summarize, suburbanization hollowed out neighborhoods with good public infrastructure and placed them with car-dependent suburbs. These car-dependent suburbs generally had worse connections to existing transportation system, which sapped their ridership, and jet aircraft were an advancement of technology, and something would have happened with them eventually, but trains were generally better for trips that are around 300 miles one way or 4 hours travel time from end to end. Okay, so hello, and sorry to butt into this in post-production, but since this was kind of short, I am just going to make this into a 2-part series instead of a 4-part series. So part 2, or at least what would have been part 2, is just going to follow this immediately in the most ungraceful way possible. So yeah, just I don't know, you're getting part 2 or part 1 extended. I don't really know. Either way, I don't know what I'm doing. New YouTuber, whatever. Anyways, enjoy. Okay, so hello and welcome back. So in the last segment, we covered the corruption aspect of the equation as to why passenger trains died, at least when it came to cars and planes. Actually, we kind of went through all of it, at least in a very superficial way. So what was the incompetence aspect of the equation, you might be asking, which is hopefully why you clicked on part 2 of a multi-part series. The incompetence part falls on the heads of the railroads themselves. Following the war, people took trains for long distance travel because the interstate highway system didn't exist yet, and airlines were expensive and unreliable. The railroad saw a huge surge in ridership during World War II and saw strong ridership after the war, so what went wrong? Well, the traveling public changed, and over the course of the 1950s, highways became more useful, which meant more cost-conscious travelers had the option of taking the bus. This also at the same time meant that there were more people who could afford to travel than there were beforehand. As mentioned in the last segment, travel was still relatively expensive, and a lot of people didn't travel, and also post-war movement gave people more of a reason to travel than it had beforehand. The highways also allowed the newly suburbanizing middle class to drive places instead of taking a train somewhere. Suburbanization also made having a family car a necessity rather than a luxury, and post-war manufacturing also made cars relatively cheaper, and they were also a symbol of success, so obviously every family, had to move to the suburbs, get the car, get the washing machine, and the whole shebang. So this leads us to the aspects of what the railroads were doing. So an issue that the railroads faced was how they treated their local trains. The Southern Pacific, for instance, didn't invest much in its local trains after World War II. Most SP local trains were still using old heavyweight equipment from before the war and pretty much used them up until the point where they were canceled in the 1960s. This also included the secondary and regional trains as well. On top of this, these trains were generally getting axed on a regular basis, which meant that the trains that could carry the most people and wouldn't compete with air travel and be the alternative to driving were getting cut first. And if they didn't get axed, they generally got the oldest, most rundown equipment the railroads had at their disposal. And also another thing that side note is when these trains usually did get axed, usually their equipment got sent straight to the scrapper. So if a train had the worst equipment, it was usually a train they were trying to get rid of, just so they can also get rid of the equipment. So what could the railroads have done to mitigate the decline of passenger travel following the Second World War and the opening of the interstate highway? Now, before we get into this is going to be where some of the more, political views bleed in again. So even if the railways did any of what I was talking about, we still would have gotten Amtrak at some point. The best case scenario would have been a healthier passenger rail system existing in 1971 when Amtrak took over. There frankly wasn't a way that the private railways were going to survive with passenger service for a decade longer without the mail subsidy, especially, considering they were treated like a monopoly despite, having air travel, cars, and planes to compete against from the early 60s onwards. And even if they did survive until deregulation, the railways still wouldn't have wanted to keep their passenger trains. Four railways did decline to join Amtrak in 1970 and kept running trains for several years, and they all eventually gave up the trains, partly because they couldn't afford new equipment or to keep them running. So the things that the railways could have done to keep passenger trains going was invest more into their local service instead of assigning them the worst equipment possible. This would have more or less meant that the railways would have needed to equip them with new equipment immediately after the war and retire all the heavyweight cars. This would have required them to, have a better coach seat, or at least what they considered a coach or a share car or what have you. See previous episode on this. This would mean requiring them to have, a more standardized coach, a more upgraded coach, something that's more than just a bench seat with padding, akin to what the chair car was on the long distance trains or what a coach is on modern Amtrak. Coach wasn't uncomfortable for short distance trains. Speaking from experience of riding them on excursion trains, but these trains are showing their age at the end of the Second World War, and they were already out of date, and people kind of knew the local trains were the red-headed stepchildren of the railways, and that they were, wanting to get rid of them. But they needed, they needed these trains to keep running, to keep people on them if they wanted to survive, at any given point in time. So the railways had to put more money into local trains at the same time they put some money into long-distance trains. Instead of having old Harriman cars from the 19-teens running well into the 50s, they would have had some streamlined cars with air conditioning, modern seats, and probably some sort of business class to compete with the buses and cars at the time. So some statistics to show what the market for trains were even today. So the statistic that trains go with is annual riders per mile, and of the Northeast Corridor, so that's for every mile the Northeast Corridor runs from Boston to Washington. It generates 11,117 riders approximately on its entirety of its route. For state-supported routes, that number is 1,957 per mile, again, approximately. And for the long-distance national network, it's approximately 219 riders per mile per year. Now, like I said, I've been saying these are approximate numbers. Some of these routes split, and I use the longer segments to calculate these since Amtrak doesn't exactly provide the exact number of who rides what and where on every train publicly, or at least know where I can find it, because Amtrak, public agency or public-ish entity, and it still doesn't provide the best ridership information in the world. What does this mean for the context of what we're talking about? This means that the railways went with preserving the routes with the lowest ridership per mile and cut the routes that would have had the highest ridership per mile. Or to put it more bluntly, the private railways only kept the trains they were mandated to keep running by federal regulations, not what would have been the stronger market. So another major efficiency in the passenger rail industry was the competition itself, meaning the railways had to compete with each other, not only just other forms of transportation. So since they were competing, they generally didn't plan their services well to complement each other or, just otherwise not be redundant. For example, at one point there were 3 different railways that ran trains from Oakland to Chicago. These were the Overland Limited and City of San Francisco by the Southern Pacific and et al. Across the country, the San Francisco Chief by the Santa Fe all the way, and the California Zephyr by the Western Pacific at Rio Grande and the Burlington. All of these routes did serve different areas that needed train service, but the point of trains back then was the sleeping car service to make more money, or at least cover the cost. Since first class passengers paid the bills, this is even true of airlines today. Business and first class pay a higher portion of the cost of running the plane than people in coach. And providing lifeline service to anyone in any part of the country is something the private sector just doesn't want to deal with. And if you did need to get somewhere with the private railways, doing so was kind of a pain. So on the map, we'll just kind of go with this. So for example, if you wanted to get anywhere in the East Bay to east of Oakland at least, to Oroville by train, you had to take an SP train to Sacramento, then get from the SP depot to the Western Pacific depot, which is about 1.5 miles away from each other, and then transfer on the train to Oroville. With Amtrak, the trains actually can make the run directly, even if it's on a different railway's track. Mind you, at this point, they actually are the same railway, so the mega mergers from the 80s and 90s, so that's a different story. So like I said, with Amtrak, the trains can either run directly between the 2 stations or at most make the transfer in the same station, because Amtrak can run on any railway, which is part of their enabling legislation. Improving Amtrak is another story, and it will be beneficial for society. But Amtrak is a foundation of a far more efficient system than trying to re-privatize the existing system, the 7 main freight railways, or have a big fight over doing something more like what the UK did, which is like the dumbest way of doing it. But again, different story. And this may or may not touch too much on the UK ever, because I just don't feel like I'm commenting on other countries' politics that much. Anyways, the reason being is the competition didn't really work because trains are like utility companies in the sense that it doesn't make sense to have an area or a cluster of cities and towns being served by multiple railways. Multiple railways at one point did serve the towns between Oakland and Sacramento, and one of them died in the 1940s. It didn't even make it to Amtrak because the route was redundant. It just didn't have a viable enough market compared to the SP, and these markets were just too close to each other. Or to put it bluntly, trains just kind of tend towards monopoly, which means it's better to have one publicly accountable monopoly than a heavily regulated private one. This also brings us into another topic of discussion, is that the private sector doesn't really have an interest in serving the quote-unquote public interest, and the public interest when it comes to transportation is having a balanced ecosystem. Having everybody drive if the trip isn't long enough to fly is just not a healthy or balanced system. Building highways just leads to more traffic, which is induced demand, which is you have the capacity to do so, so you will. A balanced system would mean having public transit for trips within cities, train trips between cities and towns, and putting public money towards these other forms of transportation, like how we've put in highways and airlines. But that's a story for another day. But to put it bluntly, if we as a society make it so that 90% of our trips have to happen on one form of transportation, that one form of transportation is going to be overcrowded. And currently that's cars in the United States. Another major problem that the old railways faced was the technology of the day. The technology that the railways used for the 1970s was really inefficient and sometimes required a lot of labor. I mean, it generally required a lot of labor. Two major advancements that happened towards the end of the streamline era was the use of head-end power in CFCs, which are chlorofluorocarbons for mechanical air conditioning systems, which prior to this, they were usually steam-driven. The problem was that the passenger trains were seeing a sharp decline in ridership, so the railways just didn't invest in newer climate control and power systems that would have actually saved them money. Head-end power would mean just having a generator in the engines that would provide electricity to run all the mechanical climate control, lights, water pumps, and whatnot, and just general creature comforts. Both of these would have saved the railways a lot of money and time. And one of Amtrak's estimates said for every 12-car train set they converted to head-end power, they saved $250,000 per year. But from what I can understand, only some commuter trains in Chicago were converted to head-end power, which I think was mostly the Chicago and Northwestern. So by and large, these advancements of technology were just never leveraged to save money on overhead. And as I said, Chicago Northwestern was like the only railway that I know for sure actually did this, that, besides the electrically powered trains, which was like a couple in the whole United States. So to conclude, the railways could have preserved their trains by embracing new technologies and by going after more fruitful markets, but they decided not to do that. Instead of investing in their regional and local trains, railways just ran them in the ground until the states or the ICC let them drop the trains, and only kept the trains that the ICC wouldn't let them drop, which ICC is the regulatory board at the time. On top of this, each private railway was its own system. These companies didn't share one passenger rail system like they do today, so every company was its own isolated system. All of these points meant that private companies can't be expected to act in the public interest, nor should we rely on them or expect them to. Private companies, whether you agree with their existence or not, have a function to perform in society, and it's to make money off the goods and service they provide. And if this lines up with the public interest, that's a good thing. But if it doesn't line up with the public interest, expect them to fail, or get socialized, or be subject to heavy regulation, or receive subsidies, or some mix of the four. Because again, if you're relying on private companies to do something for the public good is going to be expensive to do and generally not very rewarding for the private companies, so don't expect them to do it, which we'll actually get to more in part 4. But until then, I just hope you enjoy this one. This is going to be a little bit of a shorter one, so I hope you enjoyed, and we will see you in the next one, and which will be going over the concept of slumber coaches.